73%, that is the share of everything Canada exports that flows directly into the American economy, not into Europe, not into Asia, into the United States, every single day. Now, here is what makes that number extraordinary right now. In May of 2026, Canada has a prime minister who ran his entire election campaign on a single promise that Canada would stand up, push back, and chart its own course independent of Washington's pressure. Mark Carney won that mandate. Canadians gave it to him. But here is the problem that nobody is talking about clearly enough. You cannot build an independent foreign policy on top of a completely dependent economic architecture. You cannot challenge your largest customer at international forums on Monday and then send 73 cents of every export dollar straight to their market on Tuesday. That is not bold strategy. That is a structural contradiction, and structural contradictions do not stay hidden forever. They surface, they cost money, and somebody always ends up paying. Today, I am going to show you exactly how that bill is arriving. Let me be precise about what has actually happened here, because the sequence of events matters enormously. Mark Carney was sworn in as Canada's Prime Minister following an election in April of 2026. His campaign was built on a specific and deliberate posture: economic sovereignty, strategic diversification away from American dependence, and a clear signal that Canada would not simply absorb pressure from Washington without responding. Canadians voted for that posture. That is a democratic fact. Now, within weeks of taking office, two significant announcements landed simultaneously. First, Canada declared it had finally reached the NATO defense spending target of 2% of GDP, a commitment that was originally made at the Wales summit in 2014. 12 years ago, that target is now being presented as a meaningful achievement. Second, Carney began appearing at international forums delivering a consistent message that nations need to diversify their supply chains, reduce dependence on any single dominant partner, and build alternative economic relationships. He did not name the United States directly in every instance. He did not need to. The context was unmistakable to every diplomat in the room. Here is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely complicated. At the exact same moment Canada is projecting this posture of independence and alliance building on the world stage, the United States and Canada are heading into the single most consequential trade moment in a generation. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that replaced NAFTA, contains a mandatory joint review clause. That review is scheduled for 2026. This is not a hypothetical future event. It is happening now. Both governments are sitting at the starting line of negotiations that will determine the terms of North American trade for the next decade. And Canada is walking into that negotiating room carrying a very specific message it has been broadcasting publicly for months, that it is actively seeking to reduce its reliance on the American market. Think about that from a negotiating perspective for one moment. Your largest trading partner, your most important customer, the country that absorbs nearly 3/4 of everything you sell internationally, that country's trade negotiators are now sitting across the table from you. And they have been watching your prime minister deliver speeches at global forums about building alternatives to American economic influence. In diplomacy, signals matter as much as substance. Sometimes they matter more. Meanwhile, the tariff environment between the two countries remains unsettled. Various tariff measures that created significant friction beginning in 2025 have not been fully resolved. Canadian exporters in steel, aluminum, agriculture, and manufactured goods are operating inside a trade relationship that carries real costs right now. And the energy sector, which represents one of Canada's most significant opportunities for genuine economic diversification toward Asia and Europe, is watching this diplomatic environment with growing concern. LNG Canada's expansion and other major infrastructure decisions require long-term investment certainty. Investors need to know that the regulatory and geopolitical environment will remain stable enough to justify committing billions of dollars over a decade-long timeline. That certainty is not easy to establish when the foundational trade relationship with your dominant partner is simultaneously under review and under strain. That is the core strategic event. Not one headline, not one speech. The collision of all of these moving pieces at exactly the same moment. And the consequences are only beginning to surface. Here is where I need you to slow down with me, because this is the part that most coverage completely misses. Everyone is talking about the NATO 2% announcement like it is the story. It is not the story. The story is what that number actually represents when you look beneath the surface. Let me translate this precisely. 2% of GDP is not an ambitious target. It is a floor. It is the absolute minimum threshold that NATO members agreed to in 2014 as a baseline commitment, not a ceiling, not a goal to aspire toward, but the entry-level requirement for being taken seriously at the table. Latvia, a country of less than 2 million people sharing a border with Russia, is currently spending above 3%. Estonia is above 3%. Poland is approaching 4%. Canada has just celebrated reaching the minimum, 12 years late. Now, here is the unintended consequence that nobody in Ottawa seems to have fully calculated. By making this announcement loudly, publicly, and triumphantly at the exact moment, Carney is also projecting a posture of strategic independence from Washington, Canada, has handed critics a very specific and very uncomfortable question. If the defense spending increase is real, where is the corresponding improvement in operational capability? That is not a political attack. That is a standard accountability question that military analysts are asking directly. When spending increases significantly on paper, but observable capability indicators, equipment readiness, procurement timelines, deployable assets do not show proportional improvement, the gap between announcement and reality becomes a liability, not just domestically, internationally, because NATO partners are watching and Washington is watching. Now pivot with me to the second unintended consequence. This one lives inside the USMCA review itself. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement contains what trade lawyers call a sunset mechanism. Every 6 years, all three parties must affirmatively choose to extend the agreement. 2026 is that first review window. If the parties cannot agree to extend, the agreement enters a defined expiration process. Here's what makes this a structural trap for Canada specifically. Canada's negotiating leverage in any trade dispute with the United States is real, but asymmetric. The American domestic market is dramatically larger. American alternatives to Canadian goods exist in many categories. Canadian alternatives to American market access do not exist at the same scale, not in Europe, not in Asia, not anywhere that can be substituted quickly. So, when Canada enters the USMCA review carrying months of public messaging about reducing American dependence, diversifying away from Washington and building alternative alliances, the American side of the table reads that messaging. They factor it into their position. They ask themselves a simple question: how motivated is Canada to keep this agreement on favorable terms? And the answer Canada's own public posture has been broadcasting is moderately motivated, but ideologically committed to demonstrating independence. That is a weak hand, presented voluntarily. The third unintended consequence sits in the energy sector. Major investment decisions for LNG expansion require what the industry calls final investment decisions, irreversible commitments of capital over 10 to 15-year horizons. Those decisions are not made based on a government's intentions. They are made based on demonstrated regulatory predictability and geopolitical stability. Right now, Canada's largest energy investment decisions are suspended in uncertainty. That uncertainty has a price, and it compounds every quarter it continues. Let me put on the translator hat now, because what politicians say in public and what is actually happening beneath the surface of policy are almost never the same thing. My job right now is to close that gap for you. Start with the phrase economic sovereignty. Carney has used this consistently through the campaign, through the election, into the early weeks of his mandate. It is a powerful phrase. It resonates emotionally. It tells voters that Canada will not be bullied, will not be absorbed, will not quietly accept being treated as a subordinate partner. I understand why it works politically. It works because it is responding to something real. The pressure on Canada from Washington over the past 18 months has been genuine, documented, and economically significant. Tariffs created real costs for real businesses. The rhetoric around Canadian sovereignty was, at points, genuinely aggressive, so Carney's response is not invented. The mandate is legitimate, but here is what the phrase economic sovereignty cannot change by itself. Geography, integration depth, and time. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world. The two economies have been deliberately integrated through layered trade agreements built across decades. First, the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in '88, then NAFTA in '94, then USMCA in 2020. Every layer of that integration created dependencies that flow in both directions, but not symmetrically. The asymmetry favors the larger economy. That is not ideology. That is mathematics. When Carney's team talks about diversification, the honest analytical question is, diversification on what timeline, in what sectors, and at what transition cost? Because the countries Canada is courting as alternative partners, members of the European Union, Japan, South Korea, members of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, are themselves watching how Canada manages its foundational relationship with Washington. No serious alternative partner wants to build deep economic ties with a country whose primary trade relationship is visibly destabilized. This is the first layer most commentators miss entirely. Now move to the second layer, the three simultaneous pressures Carney is navigating right now. Pressure one is domestic. His voters gave him a specific mandate. They want to see Canada stand firm. Any visible accommodation toward Washington before the USMCA review concludes risks being framed by political opponents as capitulation. That is an enormous constraint on his negotiating flexibility. He cannot be seen to blink even when blinking strategically might produce a better economic outcome. Pressure two is the NATO alliance. Canada's credibility inside NATO has been directly tied to the defense spending question for years. Reaching 2% matters symbolically for Canada's ability to participate meaningfully in alliance decision-making. But as I explained earlier, the gap between spending numbers and demonstrated operational capability creates its own credibility problem with the very partners Canada needs to build the alternative relationships it is publicly pursuing. You cannot build a credible European strategic partnership while simultaneously fielding questions about whether your defense commitments are substantive. Pressure three is Washington itself. And this is the most delicate layer of all. The American administration is simultaneously Canada's most important economic partner and the source of the pressure that generated Carney's mandate in the first place. Navigating that relationship requires back-channel communication, quiet reassurance, and careful calibration of public messaging. The challenge is that Carney's public messaging, which is optimized for domestic consumption, is being read in Washington not as campaign rhetoric, but as policy signal. In diplomatic terms, there is a concept called strategic ambiguity. Used well, it gives a government room to maneuver. Used poorly, it sends contradictory signals that neither reassure allies nor deter adversaries. Right now, several analysts who track North American trade policy are asking whether Canada's current posture is achieving productive strategic ambiguity or simply creating confusion about its actual intentions? That is a legitimate analytical question, not a partisan one. Now, the energy layer. And I want to be very precise here because this is where the policy trade-off becomes most visible. Canada has a genuine opportunity in global LNG markets. Demand from Asia and Europe is real and documented. The geographic and resource advantages Canada holds are significant. This is not in dispute. The policy tension, and I want to call it exactly what it is, a tension, not a conspiracy, not a corruption. The policy tension is between the emissions framework requirements that apply to new energy development and the speed and cost structure that private capital needs to commit to multi-billion-dollar, decade-long infrastructure projects. Both objectives, climate framework integrity and energy investment attraction, are legitimate government goals. The question being asked by investors, by trading partners, and by Canadian provinces with energy-dependent economies is simply this: how is the government prioritizing and sequencing these two objectives in practical terms? That question does not yet have a clear public answer. And in the absence of clarity, capital does what capital always does. It waits, or it moves, or it. Everything I have walked you through so far has lived at the level of diplomacy, treaty language, and strategic positioning. Heads of government, trade negotiators, alliance frameworks. Now I want to bring this all the way down to your grocery bill, to your energy costs, to the kind of economic environment your children are going to be building careers inside of. Because this is where abstract geopolitics stops being abstract. Start with the USMCA review and what it means for prices. If the 2026 review produces an outcome where existing tariff measures are extended, expanded, or where new conditions are attached to Canadian market access, the cost of that outcome does not stay in Ottawa. It travels. It moves through supply chains, through import costs, through manufacturing input prices, and it lands on store shelves. Canada imports a significant volume of American goods across food processing, manufactured components, and consumer products. When the trade relationship carries friction, that friction has a price. And that price is paid at the checkout counter by ordinary Canadian families who are already carrying the weight of an extended inflationary period that began in 2022 and has not fully resolved. This is not a hypothetical future risk. It is a structural vulnerability that exists right now, today, while the review is in progress. Move to energy. And here is where I want you to feel the scale of what is actually at stake. Canada sits on some of the most significant energy reserves in the world. Natural gas reserves that Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, are actively seeking to secure as they transition away from coal and reduce dependence on less stable suppliers. European markets that have been restructuring their entire energy import strategy since 2022 are looking for reliable long-term partners. Canada has the resource. Canada has the geography. Canada has willing buyers with long-term contracts ready to negotiate. Every quarter that final investment decisions on major LNG infrastructure are delayed is a quarter where competing suppliers, Australian projects, American Gulf Coast terminals, Qatari expansions are moving forward and locking in those long-term supply relationships. Market share in LNG is not recaptured easily once it is lost. Contracts run for 15 and 20 years. The window for Canada to establish itself as a dominant Pacific and Atlantic LNG supplier is not permanently open. Now pull that all the way down to the individual level. The energy sector in Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan directly employs hundreds of thousands of Canadians. It indirectly supports employment across engineering, construction, logistics, and financial services in numbers that multiply that figure significantly. When investment decisions stall, those jobs do not disappear immediately, but hiring freezes. Expansion plans pause. Communities that have built their economic identity around resource development begin to feel the pressure in very specific and very human ways in local business revenue, in municipal tax bases, in young people making decisions about whether to build their futures at home or somewhere else. That is the micro consequence of macro hesitation. Now add the defense spending dimension. 2% of Canada's GDP directed toward defense is approximately 42 to 44 billion Canadian dollars annually. That is real money leaving other parts of the federal budget. The question of how that money is allocated, whether it produces genuine operational military capability or whether it is absorbed into administrative and legacy cost structures, is not just a military question, it is a fiscal question. It is a question about what else that money could be doing inside a federal budget that is simultaneously being asked to address housing affordability, healthcare capacity, and infrastructure renewal. Canadians are being asked to absorb that spending increase at a moment when household budgets are already stretched. And here is the sentence I want you to sit with. The decisions being made right now in the USMCA review rooms, in the LNG investment boardrooms, in the NATO capability assessments will not fully materialize in the headlines this week. They will materialize in the economic conditions that Canadians live inside for the next 5 to 10 years. The gap between announcement and consequence is always time, and time right now is not on Canada's side. So where does this go from here? I am not going to give you a clean conclusion, because there is no clean conclusion available. Anyone who tells you they know exactly how this resolves is selling you certainty that does not exist. What I can give you is 3 honest scenarios, and you can decide which one you think is most likely. Scenario A, Canada rebalances successfully. The USMCA review produces a workable outcome. Carney's team uses the public posture of independence as negotiating leverage, extracts meaningful concessions on tariff structures, and simultaneously advances 1 or 2 significant LNG commitments that signal to private capital that the regulatory environment is stabilizing. In this scenario, the mandate holds. The strategy was costly in the short term, but produces durable results. Canada emerges with a more diversified trade profile and a legitimate claim to strategic independence. Scenario B, managed stalemate. The USMCA review concludes without dramatic escalation, but also without meaningful improvement. Tariffs stay roughly where they are. LNG investment decisions continue to be deferred. Canada's defense spending hits the 2% number on paper, but operational capability questions remain unresolved. The economy grows, but below its potential. This is the slow bleed scenario, no crisis, but a persistent drag that accumulates quietly over several years before it becomes impossible to ignore. Scenario C, unintended escalation. The public messaging gap between what Carney is saying at international forums and what Washington is reading from those statements widens to the point where the USMCA review becomes genuinely adversarial. Investment confidence in Canada's energy sector drops measurably. Carney faces pressure from provincial governments and business communities to visibly recalibrate. The political cost of that recalibration becomes the defining story of his first term. 3 scenarios, 3 very different Canadas on the other side. Here is what I want to know from you. Which scenario do you think Canada is actually heading toward right now? Leave your answer in the comments A, B, or C and tell me one specific reason why. I read every single comment on this channel. And if this analysis gave you a framework that the mainstream coverage is not giving you, hit subscribe. Because next week I am going inside the actual text of USMCA 2026. The specific clauses, the specific leverage points, the specific risks that nobody is explaining in plain language. That is exactly what we do here.